Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm Simone Cavallaro, director of the Stigler Center. We are very happy to host Emmanuel Saez and Steve Kaplan for a conversation moderated by Luigi Zingales on inequality and taxation in the US. Emmanuel Saez is professor of economics and director of the Center of Equitable Growth at UC Berkeley. His research focuses primarily on inequality, redistribution, and tax policy. Jointly with Thomas Piketty, he created the Top Income Share series that shows a dramatic increase in US inequality since 1980. The data has been widely discussed in the public debate. He has received numerous academic awards, including the John Bates Clark Medal, a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, and an honorary degree from Harvard, among others. Steve Kaplan is the Neubauer Family Distinguished Service Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance. He is also a Kesenic EP Faculty Director at the Polsky Center. His research focuses on issues in private equity, venture capital, entrepreneurial finance, and corporate governance and finance. He is the co-creator of the Kaplan Score PME private equity benchmarking approach. And he co-founded the entrepreneurship program at Booth, among many other achievements. Our moderator today is Luigi Zingales. He is the Robert McCormack Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance and Charles Harper Faculty Fellow at Booth. He is also the Faculty Director of the Stigler Center. His research and interests span from corporate governance to financial development, and from political economy to the economic effect of culture, among others. He has also written several books and appears frequently in the media. Before we begin, I have one more thing. I would like to wish happy birthday to Sam Passman, who is turning 80 today. Sam is traveling at the moment, but maybe you will be able to listen to our live streaming. Sam is the Director Emeritus and a member of the Faculty Advisory Board of the Stigler Center. And from 1991 to 2005, Sam served as the Faculty Director of the Stigler Center, making him the first Faculty Director of the Center right after George Stigler. We thank him for his ongoing contributions. And now please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Okay, so Emmanuel will start by giving a short presentation, then Steve will have a short rebuttal, and then we're going to have a real conversation among the three of us. Please, Emmanuel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a delight for me to be here today to talk about our work on inequality and taxes. So most of my academic life has been about putting together a series on inequality and taxes. So with Piketty, we've documented the enormous rise in the share of income, that going to the top 1%, that has roughly doubled from 10% around 1980 to about 20% today. So the counterpart of that is that the share of income going to the bottom 50% has dropped dramatically, and the 10 points gains of the top 1% has been essentially lost by the bottom 50%. And so what that means practically is that in the United States, the bottom 50% has essentially been shut off from economic growth on a pre-tax basis. While the economy was growing, very little of that growth was going to the bottom 50%, whose income have more or less stagnated. So taxes play a fundamental role in regulating inequality. I mean, very obviously, they are the ways the community pulls together resources to then fund a number of transfers and public programs. And so while inequality was soaring, tax progressivity was eroding in the United States. That is, few people in the public remember that, but the US is the country that pioneered very progressive taxation. It was the first country to really crank up income tax rates during World War I, then developed a very progressive estate tax, and for many decades, from the 30s to around 1980, the US had perhaps the most progressive tax system in the world, with a very progressive individual income tax, estate tax, and a very large corporate tax. What we document in the book is that that tax system was very successful in taxing the rich at very substantially higher rates than the rest of the population. That tax progressivity has eroded over time, starting in the 1980s, with the Reagan administration, until, the most recent development, the big cut in the corporate tax under the Trump administration, so that today, when you pile up all the taxes together at the state, local, and federal level, the US tax system looks roughly flat in the sense that all income groups pay something pretty close to the average, economy-wide, which is 28%. It's slightly progressive, from the bottom to the upper middle class. And then what we find is that at the very top, there is some regressivity. That is, we estimate that today the very richest Americans, the top 400, the billionaires described by the Forbes magazine, are actually paying perhaps a slightly lower rate, that people at the bottom. We estimate 23%, and that's because the current tax system is not effective at taxing the very rich, who make most of their income through profits of corporations. So Jeff Bezos, for example, his income are the profits of Amazon that accrue to him. The corporate tax is almost gone, so he doesn't pay much tax there. Then, because he doesn't need the money for his consumption, he doesn't need to realize the individual income. The money can stay within Amazon, so he doesn't have that much individual income relative to his true income, and that's why the individual income tax is not good at catching his income. So that's why we have that regressive tax system. Now, what we say in the book is that nothing prevents us from restoring tax progressivity if we want to. That is, it's often presented like, with globalization, it's become impossible to tax the rich. If there is one message we want to put forward in our book, is that that view is wrong. Actually, if we want to, technically, it is possible to tax the rich effectively. In the book, we make some proposals for the corporate tax, where currently the system is such that multinationals can very easily avoid taxes by reporting their profits through tax gimmicks and tax accounting gimmicks in low tax jurisdiction. That's fixable. The US has the data to see how much US multinationals underpay and could pretty easily collect the tax that those corporations don't pay abroad. We think that's essential because multinational corporations are the most visible winners of this globalized world. So the fact that they pay so little while incomes at the bottom are stagnating really gives a devastating image of capitalism that, in our view, is not sustainable. Now, we also discussed the wealth tax that has been very visible in the public policy debate as perhaps the most direct and effective way to tax billionaires, because it goes directly after their stock of wealth. That's very visible at the top. Forbes magazine is able to put together their wealth. So a world of renewed progressive taxation is possible. There's no guarantee will be there. Now, we have in the political debate in the US, the presidential candidates on the Democratic side are really putting together tax proposals that are very radical relative to what had been discussed in decades. So that's the debate we are having, and that's why I'm happy to be here with you today to discuss these.
Thank you very much. Steve.
So, very interesting. I agree with some of the things Emmanuel said, but there'll be some places I disagree. So let me just be clear about the problem that Saez and Zuckman are trying to solve. Pre-tax inequality has increased markedly in the last 40 years. And at the same time, they think the system has become proportional, not progressive. And as a result, the top 1% have gained a lot, while the bottom 50% have not. and they view that as unfair with pernicious effects. And another thing that goes through the book is that billionaires have too much power. And finally in the book, the problem, there's sort of a sense that the tax system in the US should raise more money, and there's a corollary in their work that the government should be bigger. So I'm going to talk about that. What is the solution? So the solution in the book, and I think Emmanuel is still with the book, is that the tax system in the US should be much more progressive, and that means average tax rates for the top 0.1, 0.01% should be 60 or 70%. That's average. And that basically you should have very high taxes for billionaires and perhaps eliminate them. So that's the problem, and that's their proposal. And I want to make 3 points that I'll expand on if Luigi lets me later. So first, their estimates of the extent of inequality and the lack of progressivity are quite different from everyone else's. And so there's work by the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is nonpartisan, and actually a paper that Emmanuel wrote 2 years ago before he wrote the book, which finds more progressivity. So let me tell you what the others find. They find that the bottom 50% pay about 15%, not 30, and that at the top they pay more than 30, and depending on the estimate, up to 40%. So the tax payments are more progressive than I think Emmanuel and Gabriel say. And as a result, when you look at after-tax income and after benefits, the increase in inequality is much less. There's some estimates that say it hasn't changed. That's probably wrong, but it hasn't gone up by this huge amount that the pre-tax has because the system more or less works. The wealth inequality numbers, which are also there, have some of the same problems. Saez and Zuckman make assumptions that are very aggressive and very non-standard. Other people, including one of our colleagues, Eric Zwick, make different assumptions. And the wealth share of the very top goes from like 22% down to 15%. So there's still inequality, but it's much less than Emmanuel says. So that's point one. He's overstating, I think, the problem. And at a minimum, we can't be sure. There's a lot of uncertainty in these numbers. So take the uncertainty, probably overstated, point one. Point two, they kind of believe higher inequality is like all bad. And that's not entirely clear. Nick Kristof of the New York Times, who is a very conservative person, wrote recently, for humanity overall, life just keeps getting better. People living in extreme poverty overall in the world have fallen from like 40+% to less than 10. Half of the world today is middle class or rich. Absolute poverty has actually declined by quite a bit in the United States over the last 30 or 40 years. Bruce Meyer has done work on that. It's gone from, depending on how you measure it, 13% in 1980 to about 3% today. And that decline in kind of global poverty, where'd that come from? Technology, globalization, markets, human capital. And at the same time, that created a lot of billionaires. And so what Saez and Zuckman want to do is they want to impose taxes that effectively eliminate billionaires and potentially eliminate 50 millionaires, because that's the wealth tax cutoff. And the thing you just have to be careful about is if you eliminate those people or you really hurt them, are you going to get rid of innovation? And I'll tell you a little bit later that if you had implemented what's in that book, you would not have Tesla today, and you would not have Pixar. And it's very clear if you look at the histories of those that that's the case. And at the same time, if you take away this money from the billionaires, where's it going to go? It's going to go to the government. It's It's going to go to probably public sector unions and perhaps academics. And is that better? I don't know. Probably not. And finally, yeah, I don't want to say you shouldn't be concerned about this. So I think after-tax inequality has increased somewhat, although not nearly as much as they claim. And we've seen a flattening of life expectancies, and particularly for people with lower income. So you may decide you want to raise tax revenue and do more spending. And that may be something that we decide to do. The question is, how do you do it? And the Saez-Zucman proposals are to have a wealth tax of 2 to 3.5%, to increase marginal income tax rates to 60%, and basically increase taxes by 10% of GDP. So that's taking taxes from 20% of GDP to 30%. And what does that mean? That means government is increasing in size from 20% to 30% on those numbers. Do we want that? They also, basically in doing this, so notice those big tax rates, some of the wealthy in those tax rates, those are averages. There's going to be a number of people in the top 0.01% for whom their average tax rate is actually over 100%. Meaning some people will be lower, some higher if you have their numbers. So some wealthy people will be paying more than 100% of their income in taxes. Now, what do Saez and Zucman assume in the book? They assume two things. They assume that the wealthy won't evade taxes much, even if they're paying 100% of their income in taxes. Or if they are paying 100% of their income in taxes, if they can't evade it, then they're not going to change their innovation choices and their work choices and their choices of producing. And I just think that's really not possible. They're either going to evade or you're going to have big impacts on innovation and production. So the bottom line is they're proposing really big changes with uncertain effects based on data that I would argue is uncertain, and some people argue is much overstated. And I just wouldn't do that right now, particularly given that in the US, once you put something in, it's really hard to undo given the nature of our political system. So if you are going to do something, there are better, less disruptive ways to do it. Eric Zwick and Owen Zadar, basically say if we went back to where we were in 1997, you'd get more tax revenue, you'd get more progressivity, and you'd be doing something we'd done before. Larry Summers argues for more enforcement. There's real money there probably in doing a better job in enforcement. And there are other suggestions as well. So I think I will stop there.
Good.
And let Luigi ask us some questions.
As you can see, they really think alike. But I think that as economists, we like at least to agree on the facts. And this is, there are a lot of proposals that people can disagree or agree with. But let's try to at least see on the facts. So what are the facts in his book you agree with, Steve?
So I think the pre-tax numbers we have, there are two series. So there are the income series and then there's the wealth series. And I think the income series, the pre-tax income series are okay. It's clear.
So you agree that the 1% got a large increase?
I think that's
and also
that's
the
true.
fact that basically the median American did not see much of an increase in income over this period.
In a cross-sectional way. So this is cross-sectional. The thing that's harder to know is if you take the same person and look what happens to him or her over time, there's more movement than just looking at the cross sections. What they're looking at is, every year, what does the top 1% get? What does the bottom 50% get? And those people, are not always the same. Like particularly at the very top, the very, very top, some years someone's in it, some years someone's not, depending on the capital gains they realize or things. But bottom line is, I think pre-tax incomes have gone up.
Okay.
I agree with that.
And that's it? And what about multinationals? What about the fact that he documents the fact that basically multinational shifts 60% of their profits abroad, and they really elude in a major way corporate income tax by relocating property rights in foreign countries.
I think we can agree on that.
Okay.
Let's be clear.
Okay.
So it's a loophole, and what you'd like to get is sort of corporate taxation similar around the world, so that companies don't have an incentive to locate elsewhere. The U.S. before the recent tax cut was like 36% or 35%, was much higher than everybody else. So bringing it down to the low 20s makes it more like the other countries. And that I think is reasonable. Then getting rid of the loopholes, I think that would be a reasonable thing to try.
Okay. And what about the wealth? Do you see a divergence in wealth?
The divergence in wealth has occurred, and this is again where the estimates in Saez and Zuckman are much higher than other estimates. So wealth inequality has gone up, and part of that in their numbers, the thing that's controversial and drives a lot of the difference between their numbers and Eric Zwick's is their assumption of essentially how much fixed income or how much bonds the wealthy own versus the less wealthy. And it's a technical point, but their assumption is that basically the bottom and the wealthy earn less than 1% on all their bonds. And when you look at the data, it's very clear the wealthy have riskier bonds, they earn higher interest rates. The bottom, or the bottom half, is a lot in deposits, and so their interest rates are much lower. And as a result, it's like a $5 trillion difference in the assumption of wealth. And that's why Eric's numbers are 15% at the top, his are 20 or 22. And again, that's a big difference in terms of how much you think this inequality has gone.
Okay, but so we've got 2 points we agree, and then with 2 points where we disagree. So, Emmanuel, let's go in steps. First of all, what about this increase in inequality of wealth? And this is the criticism that Steve raises, a lot of people have raised, is the fact that, of course, you make estimates, we all do, and one way in which you impute wealth is by capitalizing some flow of income. And you can capitalize it at the bond rate, you can capitalize at a more risky rate, and of course, as all the students here know, is depending on the rate, the value is going to be very different. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, so those are good technical questions, and that's what academic life is about, refining estimates. The key point is that for wealth, we don't know as much as for income. Why? Because we don't have yet a good wealth tax, well enforced, that would measure those things well.
So for economists, the wealth tax would be good,
yes,
because nobody will fall into that category, I think,
yes.
and we get a lot of data.
Now, on the substance, we want to have that debate, refine estimates. We believe our estimates are better, than the Zwick and Zidar, but that's how academic life goes. Just to give you one example, the Forbes 400, which is a non-tax source, documents more than a tripling of the share of wealth that tiny group captures. They captured less than 1% in the early 80s. Now they are at 3.3% of total U.S. wealth.
But Emmanuel, the SCF and Forbes 400 series is still at that 15% number, which is where Eric is.
Take the Zwick and Zidar, because they've scored, the tax on billionaires, and they say that the top 400 has only 1/3 of what Forbes says they have. Well, our estimates, at least when we produced them, we were careful to make sure we would be close, to Forbes. So
maybe all the billionaires are like a pretend billionaire Trump, that
yes,
they boast their wealth to show up in the statistics, but it's not that bad.
It's possible. The point is that, I'm an academic. My life has been about putting together this series, and it's good that they generate a debate. And hopefully, if our academic world works well, we'll know will improve our knowledge.
And we agree on that.
Yes, we
but
agree
these
that-
are very highly but you're agreeing
yes,
these are highly uncertain. And you want to make big changes on uncertain stuff.
You have to be careful because when I hear you say uncertain, I can't help but thinking about climate change deniers. And so what I want to say...
Let's not go into climate change, okay? This is about inequality. It's a big enough problem. We don't need to bring climate change.
But what I want to do is that hopefully it's knowable. We academics can improve our knowledge, and that's how I want it to be framed. And I don't like when those debates are used, to say we shouldn't do anything because there's so much uncertainty. We'll never know really whether inequality is large. So let's put us in a position.
Isn't there a difference? The world is not, with climate change, the world may fall apart. Here, it's not like, so clear the world is falling apart.
Let's stay away from climate change.
Okay, we'll stay away.
Let's discuss on the topic. It seems to me that actually there is more agreement than disagreement because you both agree that wealth inequality has increased over time, and that the question is, has increased a huge amount or has increased just a moderate amount, but has increased. So I don't see like a dramatic difference here. Or am I mistaken?
There's a difference about what you would do about it. That's right.
No, but that's a difference. We're talking at least on the facts.
Yeah.
I think we agree on the fact. Inequality has increased in income and in wealth.
There's an issue, and this is an issue several people have brought up about the permanent income versus the wealth. Mm-hmm. And going back to discount rates, the discount rates on equity have gone way down, right? If you look at PE ratios have gone way up. So part of what's happened with the increase in wealth is PE ratios have gone up, and if you hold stocks, you've done well. The question is, what can you consume out of it? And so if the interest rate has also come down, so if it used to be you had 10% interest rate on $1 billion, that was $100 million a year, and now the value goes up to $2 billion, but the rate is 5%, it's the same $100 million a year. So your consumption or your sort of resources haven't changed, and that's where the after-tax income numbers are much more, after-tax, after-benefit numbers are much more important. I'm saying income inequality is much more important to look at than the wealth inequality, and the after-tax income numbers haven't changed so much.
Sorry, I might have missed something, but if you double your wealth, it's true that the income might remain the same, but you have twice as much wealth. And so if you want to leave to your children a fixed amount, you can consume much more. So you are more wealthy.
No, because if you want to consume $100 million, let's say you want to consume $100 million a year forever. Let's take that down, $1 million a year forever. Let's say you want to consume $1 million a year forever. If the interest rate is 10% versus 5%, that makes a big difference about your wealth.
I completely agree, but you die twice as rich.
But
anyway, let's move to. So we agree on that fact. The one big disagreement, it seems to me, and so I want to walk with you through the numbers because it's important, is on how redistributive the tax system is. So he's saying that a lot of estimates seems to be over. So why don't you walk through the two extreme, so we get a sense of what we are.
So, what we do is that we distribute all national income. That is, all your income, whether you make the money, as a wage or a salary, a fringe benefit, or profits through a corporation, the Bezos case. Then we distribute all taxes. So in contrast to the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, we distribute not only the federal taxes, but also the state and local taxes that are sales and consumption taxes, property taxes, and also income taxes. And the sales and consumption tax is much more regressive than the income components. And that's why when you pile them up, you find, that the bottom pays a substantial amount, and it's not that hard to understand. You're a low-wage worker, you pay already 15% in Social Security taxes. You consume your income, and that adds a significant percentage, in sales and consumption taxes. Now, the other difference with CBO is that CBO subtracts from taxes transfers that are administered through the tax system. That is, now we have programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit for low-income families with kids that give you a transfer. It's a transfer because it's not a tax refund, it's really a direct transfer. Your taxes are negative. That we say, shouldn't be subtracted from taxes because taxes are a payment, from people to the government. So if you subtract the EITC, you should also subtract food stamps, which is a similar transfer, and you should talk about after-tax income, which is something we've done in our academic work. I want to reemphasize that, yes, taxes are kind of flat, but it's true that the flat relative to your flat rate relative to income, that what the government does with the money is redistributive, because what's going to be distributed back is not going to be proportional to your income, but is going to be bigger relative to your income at the bottom. But you don't want to do a mix. You either want to look just at taxes or include all the transfers.
Okay, so let me go in steps. So first of all, let's agree, and then we discuss whether this is right or not, but let's agree that your approach is only to look at the revenue side, not at the transfer side. So if we do only the revenue side, you're saying, I am at the bottom of the income distribution, I get 15% of Social Security, 10% of implied local taxes, and includes gasoline tax, tax on cigarettes, et cetera, even if I pay 0% of income tax, I'm still at 25%. At the other end of the income distribution, let's take Bezos. What tax rate does Bezos pay?
Yeah, so Bezos, I think, is extreme because he probably pays very little through Amazon corporate tax. There were newspapers articles, and then he probably doesn't distribute himself that much. But so it'd be close to zero relative to his true economic income.
But imagine for a second that Amazon were to pay the statutory tax rate, what would they pay?
If he would pay, if the corporate income tax was truly 21% on true economic profit, that would be his tax rates. In practice, though, corporations pay a lot less than 21% in corporate tax.
But so don't you think that this is regressive just on the tax side? We have 25% on one end, 21% at best, probably less on the other end. This seems regressive.
Let me just say a few things. So first of all, if you look at the IRS numbers for the people in the top 0.001%, their taxes, federal taxes, as a fraction of AGI are 25%. If you add to that their charity deductions, which we can talk about whether they should be getting it, you get up to 34%. So I'm looking at 34% or 24% federal if you don't want to give the charity. They're paying a lot in taxes, which is sort of counters.
You're missing the exercise here because he adds back the entire corporate income. So if you are Warren Buffett, you probably make a couple of $1 million normally, but if you impute the income on his property...
I'm telling with his numbers, I used his numbers. His numbers are 23...
Whose numbers?
Emmanuel's.
Okay.
His numbers are 23%, and my number, I think 23% is too low, because let me tell you, on the corporate tax, he's assuming the incidence of the corporate tax is completely on the shareholder. Most people who do this work, you talk to your public finance colleagues, they'll say it should be more like 50-50 or 60-40.
Okay, let's talk about incidence later.
He's putting the entire incidence there. So then he does that, or he and Gabrielle do, and it's 23%. Okay, 23%. Now, if you add to that charity, they give a lot more.
That's not a tax.
But it's money out of their pockets. So if you care about they're putting money. I'm saying that's a 30. Yeah. That's a big number, but it is 23% when you do it on those assumptions that are debatable about the incidence. Okay,
but still 23 versus 25 at the bottom is flat.
But the bottom is not 25. Let's go back to the bottom. Okay. Let's go back to the bottom. In income, he has whatever income is there is pre-tax. The transfer system has increased markedly
Okay, no,
over
let's
the last.
talk about the transfer.
Wait.
Purely
Sales
the
tax. So he's paying sales taxes
Yeah.
out of transfers. So if I give you food stamp money, if I give you EITC, okay, then he's paying sales taxes out of that. So it's kind of double counting. It's not fair. If you look at how much consumption, let's go to the consumption numbers, which I think are better numbers to look at. The after-tax consumption numbers for the bottom, 50% have actually gone up a fair amount over time. And the inequality on consumption is much lower. So you have inequality on wealth, pre-tax wealth is greater than inequality on pre-tax income, is greater than inequality on after-tax, is greater than inequality on consumption. So as you go down, and presumably you care about consumption, that inequality has not grown nearly as much over the last 30 years, and I think that's the right number.
Depends on how you measure consumption, because if I buy a 250 million Degas, what is the consumption floor? I'm
using Bruce Meyer's measures, who is, as far as I can tell, the world's expert on that.
But so you disagree that forget the transfer from a fiscal point of view, there is not this flat?
No, I mean everybody has 15% for the people at the in the bottom
because
half.
they add the transfer.
But the transfer, you can't say that they're not. Look, I pay a payroll tax, and then I get an earned income tax credit. Have I paid taxes? I don't think so.
Okay, so let's then
right?
go to the transfer. So
right?
what I was trying to say is, I think that on the pre-transfer, he is right, is flat. Now there is a question of should we include the transfer or not? And I was discussing earlier with him, if you were to abolish Social Security tomorrow, you're going to get a more progressive tax system. But I don't think that Emmanuel is in favor of abolishing Social Security. So I think that Social Security is part of the reason why this is more flat. So can you explain to us why you focus on that part and not more broadly on the role of the government in redistributing from pre-tax to post-tax?
Yeah. I'm a public economist, and that's what public economics is about. Government raises revenue and then spends it, through transfers. So both sides are vital. But obviously, it's a big topic, and we've actually, in our published academic work, we've also put together after-tax income series. We wanted to write a book that focuses on the tax side to emphasize the dramatic evolution of the erosion of tax progressivity. So that's what the book is about. I agree that looking at transfers is very interesting, and we've put together a series of disposable income. That is, what do people at each income bin get, after taxes and after cash or quasi-cash transfers. And the picture, I'm sorry to report, doesn't look quite that good. That is, the bottom 50% incomes, if you exclude the elderly, who are getting big transfers, through Social Security, are kind of not stagnating, but they are growing very modestly relative to the growth of the economy. Now, if you pile up on top of that the in-kind transfer Medicaid, you see a significant growth, because it's true we are spending a lot more in healthcare, and part of that is spent on low-income people, through the Medicaid program. But it's a stretch, to say low incomes have been doing well, because in resources, yes, they get more, but a lot of that is through, healthcare price inflation. It's not so clear that in cash they are doing that much better. Now, about the numbers that everybody cites, part of our work is to influence, to do better measurement. And I think, I repeat it here, the CBO that includes only federal taxes misses something important with the state and local taxes. Doing transfers part way, just the EITC, is also not principled, on an economic basis, and so we encourage them, and actually we have active discussions with them about how, to do better.
But the numbers, I mean, the Bruce Meyer numbers include everything, and the consumption number, and those are the best numbers I'm aware of, and they show a real decline in poverty over time, and that is real. The people who I think have been hurt more are the middle. And if you look at the CBO numbers have, I think since 79, the top quintile has gone up like 100%. The bottom quintile has actually gone up 80%.
Yes.
The people who have not gone up as much in the CBO numbers are the middle quintiles, which are about 50%. But the bottom has actually done pretty well.
But
Yes,
that's
those
include
numbers.
Medicare.
But that's
and
Medicaid.
I think Bruce's numbers, I mean, I don't know if Bruce is
Bruce's
here, he can speak for himself, but Bruce is pretty adamant on this, that those poverty numbers have gotten better on an absolute basis.
They've gotten better, but what that means is that some economic growth has gone to the bottom. That's because we, in the US, we have an absolute level, for poverty. It doesn't tell you that those incomes have grown nearly as much, as the average.
But Steve, you recognize that inequality has gone up pre-taxes.
Yeah.
And we agree that we might disagree on how progressive the taxes is, but I don't think the taxes become more progressive in the last 20 years. You agree with that? Even the entire system has not become more progressive in the last 20 years.
In term on tax rates, I think it's become if you look at Emmanuel's old numbers, I think his old numbers went from the top going from something like 43 to 40. Mm-hmm. The bottom went down too. So I think
So you're really thinking that the system has become more progressive, the fiscal system?
No, not more,
Okay.
but
No more.
not a whole lot less.
Okay, so inequality has gone up. We used to have a progressivity. Should we increase our progressivity to take care of that fact that the pre-tax income has increased or not? This is now we're passing the fact and we're going into policy. So what is
now
your
we're
view?
going to policy. So state the question again.
The question is, we agree on two facts. Number one, that pre-tax income has become more unequal in the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. And at the very minimum, we have not seen an increase in progressivity of the tax system. So should we have an increase in progressivity to compensate the increase in inequality of the pre-tax income?
So if you are going to do that,
I'm asking
the
what
question
you
is
think
how-
you should do, not if. What you want.
I think there are ways to tidy up to expand the base, which would have that effect, that are probably more effective than putting in something like a
No,
wealth
but now
tax.
you are in the instruments.
I
I'm
am.
asking you what you think as your preference. You're not an economist. You're sort of an individual voting. What are your preferences?
I would say that if you look at the tax cut that we had 2 years ago, what did they did three things mainly. They cut the corporate tax, which I think was good to make it more like the rest of the world. They got rid of the state and local deductions, which is actually also good, and that's progressive. And then they cut the tax rate for everybody, and I probably wouldn't have done that. So that would be an answer. I would have made it more progressive.
Okay. Speaking about the rest of the world, did we really need to cut down the corporate taxes?
I think I agree with Steve that corporate taxes around the world have gone down a lot, but that's a terrible development in my view, because, and we discussed that in the book, if you don't have much of a corporate tax, it really destroys, your ability to do tax progressivity. Why? Because the high-income folks are going to incorporate, so that they can make money, through corporate structures and not pay taxes until they need to use the money. So it becomes like a consumption tax, and some people are in favor of consumption tax, but that's the direction we are going. And right now, with the 21%, I think we are borderline. So currently, you know, the Jeff Bezos of the world are incorporated and they pay low taxes. If the corporate tax stays at 21%, we'll see a lot more of the rich, you know, not the millionaires, but the not the billionaires, but the deca millionaires starting to incorporate, and that really will further undermine the tax progressivity. So if your view of the world, you know, and it's a principled view, you know, Steve has a model of the world in mind, you know, based on economics. It tells you it's good to tax corporations at zero, and therefore taxing the rich at very low rates is good. That's the direction we're going. We think that's a disastrous direction to go, and we think it's reversible. That is, Steve is saying the US had to lower corporate taxes because around the world the rates were lower already. And that's right, but that's a very narrow view. Our view is that you need to redesign the US corporate tax system so that you prevent, you know, corporations from shopping around to get, you know, the lowest rate by shifting their profits.
But what effect would that have on investment, right? Already people are worried about corporations not investing, and that's a recipe for getting even less.
So then you have an interesting empirical question. Would we see, you know, less investment with higher corporate tax rates? Frankly, it's an open question. The Trump tax cut was supposed, you know, to have generate a boost in investment. We certainly don't see it much in the time series, so it's debated. My view is that I haven't seen, you know, super convincing evidence that investment, real business decisions, you know, respond strongly to corporate taxes. Steve, please.
Let me give you a nice example. So let me tell you about Elon Musk. Elon Musk was an entrepreneur, and he started PayPal. And when PayPal got sold, Elon Musk got $250 million pre-tax. Okay, that left him with $180 million after tax. What did he do with that $180 million? He pumped $100 million into SpaceX and $70 million into Tesla, or $80 million into Tesla. Basically put all of his PayPal money into SpaceX and Tesla. What happened in 2008? 2008, they almost both went bankrupt. They both were on the precipice of surviving, and they survived. Now, I would argue that if we had put in a higher marginal tax rate on capital gains, he would have had, and the numbers that are in that book, he would have had $60 million less, and either SpaceX or Tesla would not exist. And I don't think anyone else would have done it. You can tell the same story with Pixar. Steve Jobs got his money from Apple. He left Apple. He put a big chunk of it into Pixar. It also almost went bankrupt. It didn't. And if you had taxed him more, he would have had to have sold Pixar. It wouldn't have been Pixar. So, you know, what I would say there is you would have Losing Nemo instead of Finding Nemo.
So, you know, let me answer at two levels on that one. You know, do high taxes on the rich, you know, kill economies? That's the key question we are debating. And I think here you have to look at the historical record. And so that's what we do in the book. And we say the United States, you know, had this enormously progressive tax system that when you put the numbers all together really imposed very high tax rates on the rich, and that was a period where economic growth was strong, even though the US was way out, you know, in the technology frontier, really dominating, you know, the world in terms of technology. High growth and very equitably distributed, where all income groups were growing at the same rate. So, you know, just from this macro picture, you know, it's hard for me to believe that you kill the economy. Now, on the issue of credit constraints, and Steve is a specialist, you know, it's true, you want capital to go, you know, to the most promising ventures, and his work has been about that. What I think is that, you know, maybe I'm too naive, you know, and Steve will correct me, but taxing wealth precisely is when you hit people who don't face credit constraints. Because if I understand something about credit constraints, if you're a billionaire, typically that's not where credit constraints are. That's why we think, the wealth tax is perhaps a better tool than the corporate tax that's more indiscriminate, and hits businesses regardless. So that's my...
Okay, so I need to open up for questions because a lot of people want the audience. So why don't you line up? There are some people with a microphone. No, yeah, they reach out. In the meantime, I want to say, I think that this debate should be solved with data. And it says, you present two anecdotes, you present a correlation. If we go to that correlation, the euro is a terrible thing because Italy was growing before without the euro, and now with the euro does not grow, so it's responsibility of the euro. So I think that those rough thing is deteriorating the debate. So let's go to more substantive econometric studies and questions. Lucy.
Yeah, I have a clarification question, trying to understand the difference between the time series talked about. Professor Kaplan, were all of the numbers you were giving excluding state and local taxes? Is that the difference between the previous?
I think if you add the state and local taxes, what I said is still true.
But is that the difference between the old work that Professor Saez has done and the new work?
I don't think so. I think the numbers with state and local, the numbers with state and local taxes are 10 or, I think if you look at the federal taxes, the CBO numbers are with just federal, but if you add state and local to that, I think Auten and Splinter do that, you get this same progressivity that everybody else gets except for Emmanuel and Gabrielle. And he'll disagree, I'm not
going to convince
I tell you to go on the internet and look for these things. They're there.
But the big difference is that, yes, CBO has only the federal, and they put in the EITC. If you do those two corrections, you get very close to our numbers. We'll write it out fully, explicitly,
my sense is on
I look at Splinter.
and
Splinter does not add the social contribution. I think that's the difference in my view. Because he reaches numbers, he adds the local taxes, you're absolutely right. And when he adds the local taxes arrive roughly at 10%, and does not include the contribution. And he legitimized not including because that's part of a transfer system. So if you include one or not include the other. So at the end of the thing, the difference is, are you only looking at the revenue side or are you looking at an integrated system? And I think on the revenue side, I think he's right. It's 25% on the is 15 on contribution.
On the integrated system, it's very different. And on the consumption side, it's very different.
But at least we agree on the facts. Then
not sure, but go ahead.
Okay. Yes.
Yes, hello. So my former teacher, James Merles, did some pretty amazing work on regressive tax system. How would you reconcile our discussion just now with his theory?
So this is a question for whom?
This is for the public finance person.
All of you?
Who was your teacher?
James Merles.
Mirrlees.
Nothing shorter than Mirlees.
Yes. Well, I mean, I like Mirlees a lot. I started doing optimal tax theory that precisely when you want to do redistribution, but the rich may work less, as Steve was warning us about, how should you set up the tax system?
Because we're now at the opposite end of his spectrum.
He has an answer. You have an answer. How much people should be taxed?
This is actually in our book. Steve wasn't quite right when he said our calculations don't even take into account the fact, that the rich may work less. We put in a behavioral response, that's how much the rich work less if you tax them somewhat more. And we think that if you don't have issues of tax avoidance and tax evasion because you have a well-enforced tax system, the real response about people working less is not that large, based on our reading of the literature. In that case, you should do, if you want redistribution, you can go up to a 75% marginal tax rate, which translates into a tax of 60% on average, at the top. That's in the book.
And that would be very, very
maybe
uncertain.
Yes, maybe Steve believes, there is a much bigger response. That is, people are really, really motivated, by the financial gain, and if they get less, they slack off.
Well, and they evade and they don't invest, and there's, it's a very big question as to how big that is. I mean, if you look at the Swiss data, which you'll have a response to, but Switzerland, they put in a wealth tax, and the maximum wealth tax was only 1%. So we're talking here 2, 3.5, maybe 6. The elasticity that John Gruber found, and again, that's John Gruber was associated with Obamacare, some of you will remember. What he found is that for every 0.1% increase in the wealth tax, reported wealth went down by 3.5%. So if we did a 3% wealth tax, wealth would disappear if that was linear. So it's big effects.
Yeah. I mean, on that one, let me rebound because we haven't discussed
I know you will.
that. Yes, progressive taxes can fail if they are poorly designed and are easy to avoid and evade. And that's something, we discuss a lot in the book. Our view is that it is possible to structure them in a way that will work well. We have examples where this was well done, but there are also many examples like wealth taxes in Europe where the wealth taxes weren't well designed, and as a result, they weren't effective.
On the estate tax in the U.S.
The estate tax in the U.S. is another example of a failing tax.
Hi, yeah, thank you. You talked a little bit about the downstream effects or response effects of people not working as much or investing as much. Can you compare the three approaches that we've talked about, sort of wealth tax, income tax, and especially an estate tax, which seems like a particularly effective way to go after lucky inheritors of somebody else's hard work as opposed to directly disincentivizing worker investment?
Yeah, so the estate tax has the advantage that it comes very late, so perhaps it has less disincentive. The problem, though, is that it comes too late and it gives sufficient time for people to plan around to avoid it. You are going to die, decades away, and you can plan your affairs so that the amount reported, at death is going to be small. That's what happens in the U.S. System. You also have the inequity that people are becoming billionaires very fast. Bezos, Zuckerberg are striking examples. Is it fair, that they pay low rates? We know that maybe, if the estate tax were working well, they would pay, but still, if they pay 40 years down the road, isn't that too late? I think the wealth tax has the advantage of taxing you once you've succeeded and doesn't tax you that much on the ramp up. While the income tax, the corporate tax taxes you, immediately. So in that sense, the wealth tax is powerful to go after established wealth, and therefore, if you have a billionaire's problem, or you think billionaires have too much wealth, too much power as a result of that, the wealth tax is the obvious, most powerful tool to address the problem.
So I'd say a few things there. First of all, if people have been evading the state tax, what makes you think they're not going to be able to evade the wealth tax? And they will do lots of things to try to evade it. You can divide up the amount of money you have. You can have various options that you put into who of your family owns things and reduce that wealth. You will also see people stop going public and stay private, which they do more in Europe, partially as a result of this. So
actually, here's a solution on that. Is say you give a share in your company. So if we don't know how it's valued, you just give 5% of your company every year.
And how is that going to trade? How is that going to get any value?
Eventually, somebody's going to sell
now
the company.
Luigi, let me give you a problem with that. First of all, you would kill the venture capital industry.
Right.
Second of all, because you're taxing that, you're taking away. Many of these people make a lot of money, and remember, and so they would be hit by this tax. The other problem with your thing is
exactly
look
his
at
thing.
it's hard to tell. The other issue is, he said, once they've already made their money and they're already established, then we're going to tax them. Jeff Bezos was worth $4.7 billion or $5 billion in 2000 at the peak of the dot-com bubble. Amazon was hadn't really succeeded then. And if you had imposed, what number do you want the wealth tax to be? 3%, 5%, what should I use?
Yes.
5%?
5%.
Okay, we'll use 5%. So if you had put a 5% wealth tax on him when it was $5 billion, that's a $250 million tax. By the time he probably would get around to pay it, which would be June, his shares were worth $2.5 billion. So now he's got to sell to get $500 million. Sorry, to get the $250 million, he would have to sell 10% of his shares. But then, oops, we have a 50% capital gains tax. Got to sell 20% of my shares. So in 6 months, under this plan, he would have to sell 20% of Amazon in that situation, which would probably, what would that do to the stock price? Probably drive it down further, so maybe 25% of Amazon. Do you want Jeff Bezos to be selling 25% of Amazon in 2000? That would be, then you wouldn't have Amazon. There would be a ton of innovation you wouldn't have. The same thing would have happened to Elon Musk. And you are really risking completely changing the system when you have other alternatives. If you think the estate tax is not so effective, tighten it up. And again, that's where Larry Summers has a nice paper where he's saying if you audit the top incomes more, if you tie up or get rid of some, what people would say are loopholes, which is one of the big ones is when you die, if you have a big capital gain, it never gets taxed. And that's one that seems like an easy one. So there are many things you can do that are far less disruptive than a wealth tax. And that's why I would be very, very hesitant to put that in.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I want to thank both of you. In particular, I think that the major contribution of Emmanuel has been that Steve now agrees with Larry Summers. We should audit more taxes and we should close loopholes. So that's a major accomplishment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.